You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens.
So
are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
And I'm Andy Fleming.
And joining us from Portland, Oregon is journalist Jason Wilson. Thanks for joining us, Jason.
Thank you for having me once again. It's always a pleasure.
How have things been? I think the last time we spoke to you was very early in the pandemic. I'm assuming everything went well?
It went well for a while, while we were locked down. And then I think everyone fell prey to that great American weakness, a false sense of security. And so now we're looking at totals, even in Oregon where I am, which has been spared the worst of the pandemic, I think it's fair to say. We're looking at, infection rates that are much higher than the previous peak. And, if you look around the country as a whole, it looks like the first wave never really crested. There was a plateau for a while, and now the whole country's on its way up again. And if you look at places like Texas, Arizona, Florida, there's really a looming catastrophe there. And it's as a result of state government, governors in particular, sort of politicizing this whole thing and, really just turning it into a political football instead of a public health issue. So it's not the best place to ride out the pandemic, but, I'm just staying at home, wearing a mask 24/7 and hoping for the best.
So also at the same time as all of that's going on, we've got this huge civil rights movement happening, as well as some bad actors looking to exploit the general chaos. You wrote a thing for Bellingcat quite recently, I think the definitive take on the Boogaloo.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say so.
There's been a lot of debate, though, about the Boogaloo boys and whether they're racist or not, and I was wondering if you could come in and drop the gavel on it.
Yeah, I think it's like any sort of nascent social movement, it's kind of complicated, but it's not that complicated. I mean, I think there are there are legitimately a number of people in this movement who are, I suppose, libertarians of a universalist bent. So in other words, they're claiming that sort of right libertarian set of civil rights, the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to bear arms. And they're saying that they're doing that on behalf of everyone, whatever race, creed, color, sex, sexual orientation. And no doubt there are some people in the movement who are genuinely of that mind. Unfortunately, there are no walls around this movement, and there are people who are influential actors in this movement who I think are really doing neo-Nazi, white supremacist entryism on this movement. And the whole Boogaloo term has a complicated history as well. Came out of a firearms board on 4chan, which is not reflexively white nationalist, but is not necessarily looking to actively repel racist actors either. And I think that's sort of set the template for the movement. So there are people within this movement who are going to need to think about whether universalist right libertarianism is actually the bulwark against racism that they think it is, because there are people who are coasting on these memes who are really actually looking to a race war. And there have always been people using this terminology who have been looking to a race war. So that's the problem with this thing at the moment. It's too simplistic to say that this is simply a cover for, white supremacy. It's not simply a front. Also, it's not a movement that's doing enough to, ensure that racist actors aren't a part of it. And I think that there is a lot of naivety amongst the people who think that they're doing the right thing. And sort of that discussion is almost beside the point, because the movement has already inspired, violent acts of political violence from people who are loosely affiliated with it. So I don't think it's it's a thing that anyone can claim that they have a handle on and that they have control of. And no, it's an insurrectionary anti-government movement that is not insurrectionary and anti-government in the cause of liberation or equality. It's in the cause of, I should be able to have a machine gun. And hopefully some people are going to reflect on that now. But yeah, it's complicated. It's a moving target. Yeah, it's not a movement that anyone should necessarily trust or that anyone should imagine is not directed at violent, acts of political violence. It absolutely is.
Is it the case that most who participate or support this movement anticipate or look forward to some kind of civil war breaking out in the United States?
I think that it's absolutely fair to say that almost everyone in this movement is talking about, memeing about, however much they might like to think it's under three layers of irony. They're talking about confrontations with the federal government. So, and then, a lot of people like the Boogaloo concept itself, the central concept of this movement is kind of euphemism or a way of talking about civil war. So yeah, absolutely. They're absolutely looking forward to or looking to participate in the collapse of the United States. And what they're wanting to bring about in the wake of that collapse, again, is not a sort of regime of equality and social justice. What they're looking at is what they're looking for rather is a situation in which government can no longer restrain white men in, having whatever firearms they want to have, in not paying any taxes, in not making any kind of contribution. So their conflict with the state or their beef with the state is really about what they see as the state's prohibitions on maximum individual freedom. It's not about the state's role in persecuting minority groups or marginal groups. It's about them and their freedoms and their capacity to own a machine gun or to drive unlicensed. It's the classic kind of libertarian thing. Now, they will say that they're supportive of the George Floyd protests, or some of them will, and will say that they're not racists and that they don't think that any of the constitutional rights that are spelled out in the Bill of Rights in the United States are, racially exclusive, and that they're going out there and participating in good faith in these protests against police brutality. But the end state that they're looking for is not the end state that Black Lives Matter protesters are looking for, I don't think. They just don't want the state to intervene in their rights to own guns, say whatever they want, and really have no obligations to the society around them. I mean, this is a long kind of discussion, I suppose, in political theory and associated debates, and we could probably get unnecessarily bogged down in it. But these are not, some of them might be anti-racist to the extent that they're making universalist libertarian claims, but they're not necessarily anti-fascist. And I think that we're seeing that play out in a lot of these Facebook groups. And I've got some reporting coming out on that soon. But I don't know what you guys make of this.
I guess one thing is I feel like I'd been seeing these guys on social media for a while before it was, before it had a name. These K is the board on 4chan that they emerged from, the gun board. And it's like, I guess the thing that occurred to me is to go, the board that, the alt-right emerged from on 4chan are just one click away. It's not like it was they were in completely separate spaces. Of course, you're going to have crossover. I guess the thing that I think of is, we've talked over the years about how people dress up these ideas with irony to sort of evade responsibility for them. And you can tick this one off on your pass around bingo if you're playing at home, but it feels like something has changed when normally that stops when bodies start dropping, which is what's happened with the Boogaloo thing, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think that, that there is this repeated appeal to the left from the far right. And I'm not a political sociologist or whatever. I don't know the kind of numbers here. I don't have a great grasp of the numbers here because it's all of the evidence we have is really on social media. But I suppose, this appeal from the far right to the left is because that, as we've seen in the last month or so here in the United States, the far right doesn't really have the numbers. I mean, any given protest in a major city, any given Black Lives Matter protest in a major city in the United States in the last month has been probably bigger than every spontaneous Trump rally since 2016 combined. So there's no mystery about why they feel this need to sort of reach out to the left and to try to convince people that they're on their side. But as I said, their goals are very different. And again, there are a lot of people who are running these pages, even very influential Facebook pages that are making very poorly concealed references to fascist politics and to contemporary fascist aesthetics. I mean, there's no reason to take anything that these guys are saying at face value. On the right, I know Attorney General William Barr this week tried to put anti-fascists and anarchists and Boogaloo boys together in this category of anti-government extremism. The question is, why are you against the government? And these guys are against the government for similar reasons to Tim McVeigh. They're against the government because they feel like, I think that the government is no longer an unconditional supporter of white supremacy or the prerogatives of settlers, and at least to a minimal extent has to take other values into consideration when they're administering criminal justice or land management. They have to at least pay lip service to other values besides those of white supremacy, and that's what's really getting these guys going. I would say that it's possible that there are people within this movement who are aggrieved about police brutality and can't, for whatever reason, bring themselves to reach out to progressive political movements and have lost faith in President Trump but don't feel ready yet to think of themselves as being on the left. That doesn't mean that you have to engage with the movement, as opposed to individuals. The movement is not to be trusted, ultimately, I think.
What then do you make of the fact that the Donald retweeted a video by supporters in which one was shown shouting white power?
Well, the problem with President Trump is that, if you fixate on a particular odd move, you can get bogged down in deciding whether it's just a matter of incompetence and ignorance or a deliberate effort to promote far-right extremism. I don't think that's particularly productive. I think but I think that if you look at the big picture, this is a president who is increasingly embracing far-right extremism as a way really of gluing his base on. I don't think that his base as it stands is going to be sufficient to win an election or even make it close enough to plausibly, steal. But I think that it's kind of all he's got. And while that base is shrinking, there are ways for him to put a floor on it, to draw the people who are still there closer to him, to kind of capitalize on the extremisms that have developed amongst the people who are still defending him, come what may. And I think that open white supremacy is no longer a thing that Donald Trump feels like he needs to shy away from. Whether or not we think he's actively promoting it, it's clearly not something that he feels like can't retweet. I think that he's sent all kinds of signals to QAnon, and I suspect Cam knows more about the details of that than me, but I know that he's done that repeatedly. He's certainly given a green light to armed vigilantes in recent weeks, the people who might like to go out into the streets of a small town with a bunch of their buddies in fatigues with semi-automatic weapons. That's happened in cities and towns around the country, and President Trump has effectively given that the nod. In the face of political troubles, he's not pivoting to the centre. He's doubling down, I think, on the base he has, which is big. It's pretty clear that whatever he does, at the very least, a third of the country is just not gonna be bothered. They're gonna stick with him. And so he's, I don't know what he thinks is gonna happen in November. Maybe he thinks he's gonna lose. I don't know. But he wants to, either way, he wants to keep a hold of those people. And I think that's signaling that he understands them, that he shares their concerns, that he's prepared to give them a dopamine rush by retweeting them. That's what he's up to. And I don't think it's a strategy. It's an election-winning strategy, but it might be a strategy that is directed to a different purpose.
You're listening to 3CR, 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to journalist Jason Wilson about the far right and Trump. In the midst of all this, we've had the Antifa scare. Antifa under every bed and behind every corner. The Trump campaign were running Facebook ads. They ran 88 Facebook ads with the red triangle logo warning against Antifa. It just seems like more gaslighting, right?
Yeah, it does. And it also seems like an effort to send people who are maybe opposed to President Trump down various rabbit holes. Even if it is a conscious effort. I mean, it may just be a matter of staggering ignorance, but I don't even think it's worth us passing the difference there. I think that the effect is the same. The effect is that it sends out a signal to, the street fascists that are a part of the president's base of support. That, put it this way, sending coded symbols in the form of, Holocaust-era markings for prisoners is possible. Totally. I mean, there are Nazis in Trump's orbit, but it's kind of superfluous. I mean, the president gets on Twitter and says that these people should be beaten up and that the radical left or even journalists are the enemies of the people. I mean, he's not in need of secret codes at this point, although it's possible that he was sending one out gratuitously. I mean, the point is that he is absolutely trying to foment civil conflict in the United States. He's absolutely hoping that there will be violence in the streets. He's always profited from dividing the country and claiming enough of a share from that division to sort of triumph electorally to keep his polls looking viable. And that's the main point. And look, I think the Antifa panic in particular is being promoted because President Trump is losing core constituencies. I mean, the biggest tell is that he's even Stevens with older people over 65 at the moment. And that's unprecedented in modern political history, that older people would be as inclined to vote for Democrats as Republicans. They've always been the most reliable conservative constituency. So that's the real thing. I mean, even amongst evangelicals, who are his most loyal constituency and who arguably were the people who got him over the line in 2016, his support is softening. He's losing support in every conceivable demographic. The Red Scare move was a lot more unnerving, I thought, a year ago. But the Donald Trump, the Trump administration, the Trump movement of 2020, looks extremely unconvincing when they're trying to mobilize this stuff. It kind of seems a little pathetic. It seemed more menacing a year ago, put it that way. I mean, it's a kind of last-ditch attempt, I think, to sort of, again, glue on the base, but also maybe get them to mobilize, a slightly larger group of people. The difficulty is that, the anti-racist movement, which has gone global, in response to, police killing George Floyd. President Trump, I think, made the mistake of associating himself with the police and vice versa. The police made the mistake of associating themselves with President Trump, or police unions did anyway. And so really, when the president did that, he sort of gave permission for this to be an anti-Trump movement as well. And I don't know how you guys are seeing it from Australia, but it seems to me that part of the reason that this went global was because, as well as being an anti-racist movement, it was a kind of anti-Trump movement, and that was something that people around the world could agree on. I don't know. I mean, at least anti-US global hegemony with someone like Trump in charge. Is that at least part of it, do you think?
I think you're right. And also because I think for many outside of the United States, already possessed of a critique of US power, Trump presents as being one of its most vulgar expressions. And the killing of George Floyd was also conducted in a way that made it clear that in these circumstances, which have been reproduced countless times, police operate with seemingly complete impunity. And so it was so dramatic and so stark and so vivid, whatever truths it contained became kind of undeniable. And what's I guess, interesting is that, as you said earlier, the numbers of people who've come out in opposition to police brutality in so many diverse locations indicate that what's been tapped into is a much, obviously on the part of black communities in the United States, but among many others, long-standing grievances that have suddenly been allowed expression, both because of the nature of the killing, but because of the response by the state and police generally. It's kind of given even more reason for people to really scream and shout. And obviously, whether it's Australia or the UK or Brazil or France or anywhere else, the same kinds of structural issues are present. So, it's a moment. But what's remarkable about it is just how, as you said, even those who would normally form part of his support base are being prepared to express some degree of qualified support for a movement that opposes racism and police brutality, precisely because it's been expressed in such stark fashion.
Or at least sit it out, right? Like that, and that's going to be a big deal in November, I think. Maybe there are a bunch of people out there they're not going to march, let alone vote Democrat, but they're just looking at the protests, looking at the handling of coronavirus, and just the reality principle is just starting to really make itself felt. And people may not be prepared to do anything beyond just kind of staying home on that day in November, but that's going to be enough. I mean, he can't afford to lose a single point, really. Biden's ahead in every swing state. I mean, I don't know how Trump claws back the advantage that Biden currently has. I don't know where new Trump voters come from. It seems to me that he's probably been shedding voters since the day he was elected and lost the popular vote on that occasion anyway. So it's the question is what happens between November and January, I guess. That's one that's preoccupying me a lot. And also, I suppose, what it looks like in the next year or two as, Trump's not going anywhere. He's still going to have a Twitter account. Maybe he'll get booted the day he loses, but he's still going to be around. He's still going to have access to some kind of media channel. And what's he going to be saying about the validity of that election, even if he's only reaching a third or even a quarter of American adults? That could be a big problem. So we're not out of the woods yet, and I don't want to jinx anything, that's for sure. But I also feel like maybe, hopefully, casting an upward glance, the wave has sort of broken, maybe, and now it's about what damage has the tsunami kind of done. Is the damage able to be repaired? I kind of already feel like we're in that phase. I think also that the Black Lives Matter movement was decisive there. Seeing that many people in the streets, seeing cities and towns around America that have rarely seen a protest in living memory, having Black Lives Matter protests, about the overreach from the right, about sending armed vigilantes into little towns after phantom Antifa buses and seeing those armed vigilantes up against local people who are simply, trying to make an entirely peaceful and pretty mild anti-racist statement. I think all of that has kind of revealed to people who might be even, reflexive conservatives what this movement and what this moment is about. And yeah, like I said before, whether or not those people actually change their minds or just stay home, either of those could be equally decisive.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Jason, but we'll ask you a few more questions on the podcast, which people can find at 3cr.org.au/yeah-nah-passaran. If people want to find you, you're on Twitter at Jason_A_W, and I understand you've got some big stories coming.
Yes, indeed. Always. But yeah, some stuff about the Boogaloo Boys, some stuff about a significant leak come from local, state and federal police forces in the United States. Some stuff about Australia even, and the far right in Australia. But yeah, all will be revealed in coming days, as they say.
You're listening to 3CR Community Radio, Melbourne's voice of dissent. 3CR Community Radio, 855 on the AM dial, streaming live at 3cr.org.au or on 3CR Digital in Melbourne.
I was going to say, Jason, that I think the possibility of Trump winning in November is partly predicated on the administration's ability to suppress the black vote. Obviously, I assume they're doing their best to try and ensure that's the case. And as you said, also, even if Trump loses, there's the matter of the damage he's done to US institutions and the ways in which his various appointments, that legacy is going to carry on for some years. So if Biden wins, assuming he's willing to address these matters, it's not going to be at all straightforward.
No, that's true. There is the chance that he'll win. And, I will say that I was always, I think I've got stuff out on the record saying that I was, showing that I was always saying that there was a chance that he would win. And now, and that was just because the sense I had that he had a kind of momentum and, a series of arguments that could be deployed against Hillary Clinton in particular of all the Democratic candidates really effectively. I don't think the momentum is with him now, and I think he's uniquely ineffectual. I don't think that we're going to see an authoritarian government in the United States with Donald Trump at its head. But that doesn't mean we're not going to see an authoritarian government. I mean, my worries are, as you say, that how much of the United States population now has been permanently radicalized and just been isolated in a bubble of conspiracy thinking and kind of cult of personality around Trump. I don't know, but it's probably tens of millions of people. That's not an easy problem to solve. I think the other big problem, which, is something that I'm going to be looking to in my reporting from here on out, is that, I think that the point that a lot of anti-fascists and others have always made about the danger of, far-right politics is that it's inherently violent, it lapses into acts of terrorism, and those acts of terrorism inspire an authoritarian response. And, whether that comes in the form of statute or police practices, that authoritarian response is never limited to the far right, so that you have a kind of ratcheting up of authoritarianism as it's applied to any kind of radical political movement. And so, I think that the classic example is the way in which domestic terror enhancements were applied to people, radical environmentalists who, we can argue about what they did, but it was limited to property damage, pretty much, arson and, other kinds of attacks on property, who were not comparable to Timothy McVeigh or any of the people in the 1990s who carried out deadly acts of violence on people. I'm concerned going forward that we're going to see a kind of counter-terrorism response to far-right terrorism in the United States, as in, a sort of a response analogous to the war on terror, but domesticated. That the stimulus, the reason, the excuse is the far right, but that doesn't stop with the far right. So you've got people arguing now that there should be a way to designate domestic groups as terrorist organizations, which hasn't been possible before due to an understanding of what the First Amendment implies. You've got people saying that there should be statutes, specific domestic terrorism statutes going beyond the statutes that apply to murder, arson, bombing and the terrorism enhancements that already exist. People who are saying that really anything short of a specific terrorism statute is going to be insufficient and is going to mean that people don't get long enough sentences or that they are released into the community before they should be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm concerned that there's a kind of looming climate catastrophe that is going to invite a radical response, not, from the right to some extent, but also from the left. And I'm worried that a new terrorism statute is going to be an appealing way to kind of shut that down. That's my other concern, that far-right terrorism will work in the way that it always has, which is to invite an authoritarian response from the state, which is then generalized to everyone who's outside a sort of arbitrary line when it comes to dissent.
One thing I noticed recently, which we're speaking on a slightly different level, but just recently it was announced that the very popular subreddit, The Donald, has been removed from the platform, which was the headline, but at the same time, they've also removed the Chapo Trap House subreddit as well, and it seems to be part of a general purge on the part of Reddit to remove all kinds of material. I think something like 2,000, it was estimated, subreddits had been removed, and employing, I guess, a kind of similar logic, which is to identify particular political perspectives as being extremist and applying the same methodology in terms of their repression, I suppose. But certainly in Australia, the groundwork has been laid for the criminalisation and the, I guess, what would you call it, terrorisation of climate change activists. That's been going on for some years, and I think intimately connected to the fact that the coal industry and extractive industries continue to play such an important role in the Australian economy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I don't think there is a carceral solution probably to racist right-wing extremist movements. I think that young men in particular get pulled into these movements for similar reasons that people get pulled into cults or, other kind of exploitative extremist positions, I guess. And so, there are probably other solutions available to that. But yeah, what it's really about, in effect, look, I don't think, I doubt that Reddit is sort of making these kinds of calculations about placing a particular limit generally across the society or the culture on free speech. I think they're making pragmatic decisions, and it's possible that they're really wanting to get rid of a whole bunch of racist and far right subreddits, but they want to kind of look even-handed at the beginning of that purge. It could be something as pragmatic and kind of dumb as that. But yeah, I mean, there is a danger in a moment where extremism is a thing that's being cracked down on, not racism, not the promotion of violence against marginal communities, not, the profession of a belief in a genocidal ideology, but just whatever, standard deviations from the centre of politics. I don't think that's the thing we should be worried about, and I don't think that's the thing we should be criminalising. What we should be doing is consistently enforcing and being vigilant for, acts of political violence against communities who don't necessarily have a great deal of capacity to participate in the political process as it stands. I mean, look at the empirical data there. Left-wing terrorism, even as the government defines it, even as the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice defines it, has really been negligible for the last decade, increasingly negligible. There have been almost no acts of political violence, let alone sustained political violence perpetrated by, the political left in the United States. Almost all of the political violence in the United States has been perpetrated by the far right. And if you bracket 9/11, which was obviously an awful mass casualty event, the majority rather is white supremacist extremists. And, in saying that, I'm not arguing that, that jihadi extremists are a left-wing movement. Far from it. But yeah, I mean, that's where we're at. I think the problem is that just as law enforcement is being forced to acknowledge that, it's being absorbed into this discourse of counterterrorism. And, I don't know what, I can't pretend to know what the Biden administration will do in terms of foreign policy, but it seems to me that the war in Afghanistan is lost. And, at some point, some president is going to say, let's just pull out of there. And then there's going to be this whole apparatus that's been built up throughout the war on terror that's going to have no object, nothing to orient itself towards. And I fear that's what's being done at the moment with far right extremism. And I think that and various experts I've spoken to have told me this, that can probably mostly be dealt with within the framework of existing laws if law enforcement agencies take it seriously.
Speaking of people who are a threat to our communities, Andy Ngo recently testified before Congress about Antifa. What did you make of that?
So I must confess that I did not watch it, and that was kind of deliberate. I saw the whole move of so the hearing that Andy spoke before was a hearing from the Oversight Committee in Congress specifically into police violence against journalists and the First Amendment threat that police were posing. And so I thought that the minority on that committee, the Republicans, were really, stretching the whole nature of the inquiry to kind of bring Andy in. And essentially, as I understand it, he was brought in to say that Antifa were an equivalent First Amendment threat to the police. I'm just going to ignore his testimony, if you don't mind, and just reiterate the idea, I think, that there's an increasingly desperate resort at the moment from the right to familiar bogeymen, I guess, familiar, scare narratives. So the Red Scare, the immigrant scare, they're going to try everything on in the lead up to this November election, bringing Andy in to discuss Antifa. The comparison between the journalists Antifa have injured and the journalists that the police have injured is probably the one you want to look at this point. And, over the last couple of months, police have been deliberately targeting journalists. I think that's incontrovertible at this point, if you look at the evidence. So I don't think I want to engage with that distraction. I just want to say that police and the police unions are part of the political right in this country. And like every part of the political right in this country, they're desperately trying every tactic in their books to avoid accountability, from the accountability that is embodied in police reform to the accountability that is embodied in elections. And I don't think it's working anymore. And I think that, inviting the testimony of Andy Ngo at an oversight committee hearing is an indication of how badly they are faring at the moment. I'll leave it at that.
They're not sending us their best, are they, Jason?
They are not. And I don't want to sound too bullish. I don't want to sound too confident in my predictions about what's going to happen in this country over the next year, because I think whichever way it shakes out, it's going to be dangerous and awful. And we're not going to be through the coronavirus epidemic by November. Things could break either way at any moment. But so the guy's name is Osita Nwanavu. He writes for the New Republic. And the article he wrote is called The Disappearing Backlash to Black Lives Matter. And the point he makes, he looks at polling data and shows that there's been, I think this was widely reported, there's been this enormous increase in sort of favorability according to public opinion polling, with respect to Black Lives Matter. And, he's usually a fairly pessimistic writer. I mean, he's, a man of color, a black guy, and he's, usually pretty pessimistic when it comes to American politics for understandable reasons. But he kind of looks at the crowds in the streets and looks at the polling and and kind of, at least provisionally says that this looks like a kind of backlash to extremist politics, but not like 1968, not a backlash to left-wing extremism, but a backlash to right-wing extremism. When you look at the people protesting in little towns, when you look at the size of the crowds, when you look at even police departments saying, well, you've got a point. Can we negotiate? He says the key passage is, in short, America is already in the middle of a broad and electorally significant cultural backlash against radical politics, but it's a backlash against the right, not the left. And, you've seen the Supreme Court in the last month, strike down a challenge to abortion, affirm that trans people have rights at work, that trans people's rights at work, Trump, as it were, the religious beliefs of their employers. You've had them say that Donald Trump's executive order on Dreamers is not valid. It doesn't stand up in court. I mean, you've had the Joint Chiefs of Staff kind of say that, Mr. President, we're not going to obey an illegal order. There's a kind of, and all of this is being led by the people in the streets. I don't want to say that the upper echelons of important national institutions are the prime movers here. They're not. They're responding to what's going on in the streets, and they're making their bets, I think, about who has momentum at the moment. I think that is going to play out not only up until the election, but afterwards. And that really, that is the product of not only the period of the Trump administration, which, as Andy said earlier, is just really the most vulgar expression of a lot of things that have been in the air for a while. It's a kind of pent-up reaction to 30 or 40 years of this stuff. And I think also, that for better or worse, a lot of working people have lost their jobs. And for the first time in a long time in the United States, people can't work 3 jobs just to make ends meet, even if they want to or need to. And they have time. They have time to, think about what's going on. They have time to talk to people about politics. They have time to get out there in the street. And as soon as they had the time to do that, they were part of a steamroller that I think has rolled over this presidency. I don't see how he claws it back from here. I don't think it's going to be even close enough to steal, if you know what I'm saying. It would have to be a really egregious crime at this point if these polls are anything like accurate, and if they don't improve for him in an unprecedentedly positive way. I think he's kind of done. But like I've been saying, that just means we're at the end of the beginning, probably, in terms of working out what the future of this country is going to look like.
I have noticed recently that there's been expressions of, increasingly voluble expressions of discomfort from among the QAnon cult towards the Trump regime, and their faith is being increasingly tested as time progresses, and there's not a wave of arrests of, pedophiles and whatever other craziness has been preoccupying their minds. And it seems that even among those who are or have been the most dedicated of his followers over the past few years, even they are beginning to express doubt. And it's just the chasm that exists between his promises or their fantasies about what the Trump regime promised and what it's actually delivered has become almost unbridgeable for many. And it seems like, for some at least, that means moving away from those ideas, perhaps. But for others, it's an opportunity for them to redouble their commitment, which I think is obviously, whatever happens, it's in those circumstances that you're more likely to witness violent outbreaks of some sort, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the latitude for passivity in American politics, I think, is much greater than in Australia. I mean, you can just disengage and stay home. Lots of people do that every election. But even if you have in the past been a committed supporter of the president, you can even lie to pollsters if you want. On the crucial day, you can stay home. I think that Trump has been mobilizing people against him for most of the last 4 years, but he stepped that up in the last couple of months. I don't see what's mobilizing people in his favour, or mobilizing people in his favour who were not already so mobilized. So in other words, he's not. I don't see that there's a way for him to attract new voters. And yeah, while that's going on, the polling is telling us that evangelicals are softening. As you say, observationally, you can see that QAnon people are going, well, what's going on here? I mean, and if you take QAnon people as the kind of limit case, I think the big picture is that, or the big question is that what has Donald Trump actually delivered to the various constituencies that voted him in? He hasn't built a wall, or not really beyond the wall that was already there. He certainly hasn't built a wall from coast to coast. He has appointed a lot of judges, that's true, but what have those judges delivered, the Supreme Court judges in particular, delivered to those core constituencies who were, I think, expecting the rollback of same-sex marriage, and we're expecting Roe versus Wade maybe would get overturned, and we're certainly expecting that an executive order from the president banning Muslims would sort of have some kind of effect, because that's one of the few things that he's done that is sufficiently decisive, is decisive enough to appeal to the more action-oriented parts of his base, let's put it that way. I just don't know what he's delivered. I don't know how he gets new voters. He certainly lost a lot of voters. And so, it's going to be interesting for the remainder of the year, because I think at some point Trump or the people around him are going to realise that he can't win. And so kind of what do you do from there? Yeah.
Might pull an October surprise and bring all the mole children up from the tunnels.
Yeah, that's possible. The tunnels are full. The mole children are registered to vote. So,
well, we might leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us, Jason.
Thank you. And always a pleasure, as I said at the top.